It's a big day in the national capital of India, New Delhi, because India is now hosting the G20 summit, and US President Joe Biden's first visit to India comes as India hosts this grand mega grouping summit. Now, as soon as Air Force One touched down, all eyes were set on bilateral talks that in fact did take place between Prime Minister Modi and US President Joe Biden at Prime Minister Modi's residence. The bilaterals come only 2 months since Prime Minister Narendra Modi's own visit to the United States. The leaders touched upon various issues and various avenues in which India and US can join hands and work together. Now, the leaders have also discussed about transforming the India-US strategic partnership across all dimensions with mutual understanding. Prime Minister Modi and President Biden reaffirmed the importance of the Quad in supporting a free, open, inclusive and resilient Indo-Pacific. The Prime Minister has also welcomed President Biden to the next Quad Leaders Summit to be hosted by India in 2024. On the other hand, President Biden has lauded India's G20 presidency for demonstrating how the G20 as a forum is delivering important outcomes. And President Biden has reaffirmed his support for a reformed UN Security Council as well, with India as a permanent member. And that does seem like a promise from US. Number of topics, including a deal for jet engines, procurement of Predator drones and collaboration on critical technologies networks was also discussed. Prime Minister Modi and President Biden welcomed the signing of an MOU between Bharat's 6G alliance and Next G alliance as a first step towards deepening public-private cooperation between vendors and operators. US President Joe Biden has welcomed India's request for 31 General Atomics MQ-9B remotely piloted aircraft, which will also enhance the Indian Air Force. Overall, with President Putin of Russia and President Xi Jinping of China giving this summit a miss, how much of an advantage is it going to be for President Biden? Will he be able to woo the buyers of China and the buyers of Russia? We'll figure it out in just a bit. For now, here's a quick report. One of the biggest challenges to India's G20 presidency is going to be the test of its multipolarity rhetoric. Can India bring Russia and China to address the Ukraine war in the leaders' declaration, a major geopolitical issue that had been rejected by both the countries at the summit in Bali last year? The G20 communique in Bali last year echoed Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's message to Russian President Vladimir Putin. It said that today's era must not be of war. A sentiment that echoes with India's G20 theme of Vasudev Kutumbakam. One Earth, one family, one future. And that's why China and Russia's statement on Ukraine becomes a mammoth challenge for the host nation.
We saw that last time in Indonesia, and I'm hoping that India will be able to at least equal what Indonesia was able to do last time, given even the very, very difficult circumstances we find ourselves in today.
But India is a natural leader of the countries of the global south. It has walked the walk of non-alignment all along, and that's very relevant in the present, deeply polarized global environment.
But foreign policy analysts believe that there are other global issues far more pressing to the G20 members than the war in Ukraine. Also, as the leading voice of the global south, can India bridge the gap between the underdeveloped and developed nations by bringing together nations of the global south and the global north to address pressing issues of poverty, underdevelopment and climate action? Come hell or high water, India must overcome climate change hurdles. One that includes phasing down of fossil fuels, if not completely phasing out.
Green energy, again, somewhere like in developed markets like the US and particularly Europe, have a very stringent, very tough green agenda where they want to go to carbon zero by 2050. And for developing markets, that's not really an option in so much as you need energy, because everybody in the developing world is still in the fast growth stage, and they need energy in order to keep their GDP growing. Whereas, here in Europe, it's slowing down already, and everyone's looking more at efficiency and cost.
And even though India's G20 presidency is riddled with challenges, it offers a plethora of opportunities too. India can promote digital literacy, e-governance and healthcare, considering it's a hub of vaccine production and a major supplier of generic drugs. India can also leverage technology for sustainable development. The UPI is a big success domestically, but now India can use its G20 presidency to market the platform at a global level. And here's New Delhi's biggest opportunity, carving G20 as a global arbiter in international affairs. That too as a multilateral instrument where all members are treated equally.
The India in charge of the G20 this is one of the key bodies that's also emerged as a challenge to the Western-dominated system. And in that sense, the G7 has become much less important than it used to be. And the G20, in many ways, it's taken over as the leading economic body. And there's almost parity between the developed world and the developing world. I think the Middle East is about to join the G20, which would actually put the developing world into the majority in the G20, and therefore it is a more representative body.
India is assuming the role of global leadership when the United States is no longer a global policeman. China and Russia are already perceived as authoritarian regimes, precisely why it would be interesting to see if India can lead from the front. With video journalist Ravi Ranjan, Akanksha Swaroop, CNN News 18.
As India gets G20 ready, the government hopes to host a spectacular event and to show to the world that yes, it can. While presidency of the G20 has come naturally and as a matter of procedure to India, it's important for the government to showcase to the world that India can stand up to the turmoil in the neighborhood and also leave a footprint in the global space. With irritants like China trying to surge ahead. On multiple occasions, PM has made the point that it's tough to ignore India. This is one reason why the PM insists on meeting the Indian diaspora on his travels abroad. Calling them ambassadors of India, he hopes to tell the world that Indians succeed wherever they go.
Friends, the Indian diaspora are excellent ambassadors of India at the world stage. Wherever they have gone, they have taken with them the ethos of India.
The government plans to use this as a benchmark for 2024 too, to make the point that India and its PM is Vishwamitra, a friend for all and the world, where the vaccine Maitri, when India supplied to many needy countries who were short of vaccines, to help the earthquake victims of Turkey, to evacuation of those stranded and caught in the Russia-Ukraine war.
Today, the G20 comes at a time where a rising India, on the way to defining the new India, right, is being applauded all over, not only for its own achievements. Vishwa clear, Maitri clear, but it's not confined to just vaccines. It's confined to how you act, how you reach out to people. Why the World Bank, why the Gates Foundation think that what you are doing for India is replicable on a larger scale in the global south. That is what India and the G20 is all about.
The government, however, wants to make it clear to the visiting countries that it's no pushover. It will make a strong pitch for protecting its frontiers, fair deals on trade, fair terms of investment, and the right of India to be Atmanirbhar. But this leaves the opposition unimpressed.
The G20 summit is being used as a political gimmick. Even the symbol has the lotus in it. And although Mr. Modi has distanced the BJP lotus from the G20 lotus, The fact of the matter is that both of them are lotuses. And when I look back to the non-aligned summit of 1983, in whose organization I was involved, it was organized within 3 months. And we didn't have all this closing of roads and repainting of the city and so forth that is now going on. So all this is excessive.
यही दहाड़ है जो वैज्ञानिकों को रोमांचित करती है.
There is, however, no denying the fact that as India gets independent in trade and economic terms, as growth stories come out of villages, as countries clamour to do business with India, and as we are on the moon post-Chandrayaan mission, the PM and his pitch for strong India can no longer be ignored.
If there has been one hallmark of this government, in this tenure at least, it has been a stress on improving India's global image. And that is the reason why the Prime Minister, when he goes abroad, he always talks about the work done by the Indian diaspora, as well as how India is becoming increasingly Atmanirbhar. No longer should we accept the tag of being the third world or developing country. And in that sense, the G20 summit is going to be yet another attempt being made by this government, by the BJP and the Prime Minister himself, to make the point that it's going to uplift the image of his government and that of the country. With Chintan Depuri in New Delhi, Pallavi Ghosh.
All right, let's try and get in a sense of perspective in terms of how significant is the US President Joe Biden's visit to the G20 summit and the bilateral that's just taken place between US President and the Indian Prime Minister. And for that, let me introduce my guest today. I'm joined in by senior US journalist and author Ray Locker. Many thanks to you, Ray, for joining in. Let me begin with a very crucial aspect to Joe Biden's visit to India. Remember, everybody's talking about how the US intends to come up with a more better financial multilateral system, which is perhaps a friendlier alternative to China's BRI, and which is where the role of IMF and World Bank becomes extremely crucial. Ray, to begin with, do you think that the world has finally woken up, even though a little late, to the importance of IMF and World Bank in rescuing developing countries financially, a crucial aspect, something that was being taken advantage of by China?
Right. Yeah, I mean, China has always been kind of this alternative out there, like, oh, we're having problems with the IMF and the World Bank. Let's go, work with China. And I think it's to the credit of the Biden administration and folks that are aligned with those two institutions that they realize that. And so to the extent that they can provide a better alternative to the developing world and countries that have problems, so much the better for them. And the better for the U.S. Aligned economic bloc, which I hope includes India.
Ray, US has made it clear that it has a plan to offer an alternative to Chinese lending that has been described as cohesive, and it also insists that it's not targeting China because China is also a World Bank member. But will Joe Biden be able to manage that kind of funding that the World Bank and IMF need from the United States? He's already asked the US Congress for $2 billion. How much rests upon that promise by Biden and his government?
Well, he needs to get the money. I mean, when you promise something and you can't deliver, that's a bad look for everyone. I think that there are enough people in Congress who realize the importance of this, but with a Republican-controlled House, it's anyone's guess. They can be very isolationist. They're not looking to do Biden any favors. So that's a wrinkle that's involved in that, and we'll have to see, whether he can navigate it. He's been tremendously successful navigating many things with Congress, certainly in the last session where he had basically a tied Senate and a very closely split House. So I would not underestimate him. I wouldn't rule him out, but he has some challenges.
Right. Ray, what are your hopes as far as the Delhi Declaration is concerned? We've seen Bali faced a lot of issues due to the war in Ukraine. Will US, Russia and China, even though Russia and China are not represented by the heads of states, be able to sort of help India navigate that tricky terrain to come up with a joint communication, all leaders declaration? Because remember, a lot rests upon this declaration because we are talking about the, addressing the impact of conflict or impact of war, something we've already seen through food insecurity, energy crisis, and of course, indirectly impacting economies world over.
Right. Well, I mean, I hope so. I'm not holding out a whole lot of hope because Russia has to go along with it. Russia's the instigator of this massive human rights violation that is the war in Ukraine. Anything that it sees as limiting its flexibility there, it's not going to support. China is anyone's guess. I mean, China, by all rights, should be on the side of the rest of the civilized world. It's not. It's trying to split the difference. Everyone sees what it's trying to do, and it's not working to its benefit. I mean, from a U.S. perspective, and I think from a human rights perspective, there's only one side to be on in this fight, and that's on Ukraine's fight. Russia, started a war against a sovereign nation. It's killing people indiscriminately, and that can't be rewarded. And because of those attitudes, I think it's going to be very hard for all these sides to come together on some New Delhi declaration because, of the existence of this war. I hope they can. I mean, the world has a lot of problems, starting with climate change, food insecurity, and those things supersede the war in Ukraine, I hope. But it's a considerable stumbling block.
Absolutely. And when we talk about G20 as a multilateral forum, the fact of the matter remains that it's one of the biggest groupings, because you look at this grouping as one that combines the global north and the global south with 3/4 of the country, of all the countries over there, making up for 85% of the global population, also contributing significantly to the global GDP. Having said that, world leaders like Xi Jinping and Putin are now absent from the G20 summit. What is the kind of message that is going out? This is a multilateral platform bigger than the SCO and ASEAN, even BRICS. When leaders like Putin and Xi are absent from such an important meet, what is the message coming across as far as the current geopolitical climate is concerned?
The message is that those two leaders have problems that are bigger than the G20. And so they're afraid to leave home for whatever reason. I don't think it's a comment necessarily on the G20's validity or value, but it's more about those two men themselves. And really, who trusts Vladimir Putin? If he comes to the G20 and tells you something, are you really going to count on that? I mean, he's broken promises left and right. So I think it hurts Russia, it hurts China for those two guys not to be there. I don't think it's necessarily fatal to the organization itself, but it's just a reflection of the problem that Putin got himself into and then the related problems that China's facing.
Right. Many thanks to you, Ray Locker, for joining in with your precious inputs. It's been a pleasure to have you on our show. And remember, that brings me to the end of this newscast at News 18 Global. But don't go anywhere, because News 18 will keep bringing you all the latest minute-by-minute coverage of the G20 summit that's taking place. Remember, the countdown has only begun. The 2 days of the summit that still remain. And you can tune in to our YouTube landing page, which will direct you to all the G20 footage from India showcasing its might as a global unifying force, to all the way showcasing its culture and weaving the narrative using its own might, only to bring all those countries of the global south together at the G20